This is Sawyer Robertson, and you're listening to the Bearcast on SicEm365.com.
Welcome into the Bearcast on SicEm365.com. I'm here with Colt Barber. I'm your host, Grayson Grundhoefer, and today we are going to talk about this huge decision that just happened over the weekend. The House versus NCAA settlement was approved. This was a massive conversation piece over the course of the offseason, something that every school across the country was kind of working under the assumption that this was going to pass, but it was also something that your hands are tied a little bit. It's still kind of up in the air. This is now going to allow schools to basically pay for players. I mean, that's what this is. Yeah. Now it's a revenue sharing component to this. Each program is going to have roughly $20.5 million to spend on all of their athletics. Every single team. There's a lot of estimations on how that's going to be divvied up. We'll get into that here in a little bit, but in general, a landmark decision for college sports and something that completely gets rid of amateurism. I mean, it's completely gone now.
Yeah, and I truthfully believe it's this step between chaos and collective bargaining, which is eventually at some point going to happen where all this stuff is controlled like it would be in any other pro sport. This is kind of the middle ground of getting to that point. And I think it's good for the sport. Eventually it could show to be the perfect solution, but I think right now we're moving towards collective bargaining, however far that is away. But from our vantage point, you talk about Baylor, you talk about TCU, Oklahoma State, that window of schools of how are you going to compete? This is the best news possible. And because of the fact that there's not unlimited resources at places like Baylor. Now, Baylor has plenty of money. That's not necessarily the issue. It's the overall numbers of how do we rally these for these collectives? How do we get, a roster that potentially is $20 million a year? Like we heard about that with Ohio State. We've heard about what Texas could potentially be paying out to their roster. There's no way for schools like Baylor to be able to pay from their sheer fan support for these collectives to get these kids on rosters. And so this passing was huge, and it was delayed. It seemed like this thing was out there forever of when is this going to happen? Once it hit into the House and they started discussing this at a political level, it just seemed like it drug out forever. It hurt baseball because it was delayed a little bit, and the portal opened up, and some of these guys began to go in the portal without having deals done. But now it's stable in a great sense, and I'm excited to see if it does become a good solution, if it is a long-term solution. But in general, I think you, as a Baylor fan, as a fan of a middle road school that doesn't have massive support in terms of numbers, this is the best news possible because it creates at least somewhat of a level playing field. Now, we're going to talk about it, but the enforcement arm, all that type of stuff, if that works, is going to tell the story of if this is truly in favor of everyone in the country.
Absolutely. So real quick, Sawyer Robertson has something to remind you about.
Want the latest information about your favorite team? Try out SicEm365 premium content the next 3 months for just $5 by clicking the link below.
And now back to the Bearcast. Just going through a few kind of quick hitters on kind of what's coming up because of this settlement. There's going to be a college sports commission, which is going to be, I guess, officially created soon, but a former MLB executive, Brian Seeley, is going to be the CEO of that. And so he's going to be very much in charge of the enforcement piece of this. So that's just kind of one news nugget there. I know you've mentioned Seeley a little bit before we started talking, but what are your kind of thoughts, things you've heard potentially about what Seeley could do as the CEO of this commission?
Yeah, I mean, he's going to be the guy that a lot of people hate when their schools start getting in trouble. I mean, that's ultimately what he's there for. He did it in MLB. I mean, he's a former federal prosecutor. So put that in perspective. Like he's not out to make friends. That's not his job. He is to be over this. And I think that's the most important distinction is that people get confused on, is this an NCAA sanctioned deal that's going on? No, this isn't. The NCAA is removing themselves of this thing entirely. And a guy like Brian Seeley is stepping in to run the governance oversight. And then they're going to pair with the clearinghouse called NIL Go and basically just govern these deals to make sure they're fair market value, make sure that they are, it's not necessarily these strict numbers that like this deal is worth this much and this is all you can pay, but they have to be within the ballpark. And when those deals go beyond that is when a guy like Brian Seeley steps in and he's kind of the enforcing arm of what they're going to do. And I'm excited about that potential of Brian Seeley of there shouldn't be this huge, long process of determining, punishments for teams that create, that have or caught cheating, that have problems in regards to NIL or revenue share. This is just going to be, hey, you screwed up, you broke the rules, here's your punishment pretty quickly. And I think that's going to scare programs in the long term and in the short term much more than this 10-year process to determine punishments. And so I'm excited to see it. But that the enforcement at the end of the day is going to be what makes this work. If that enforcement is not satisfactory, then it doesn't matter. Like, what's the point of doing it? It's going to be the same thing that we've always dealt with the NCAA. The rules are there, the punishment and what's going to happen when these teams do cheat never really even mattered.
Right. So I was, I guess, just kind of reiterating the clearinghouse piece to make sure everyone's kind of on the same page here. So the $20.5 million is the budget annually for each school, but players can still get NIL deals. That can still happen with outside companies. But what you mentioned was the clearinghouse, which I believe is going to be run through Deloitte, is going to ensure that there is fair market value. So you're not going to have these kind of under the table deals in which you're kind of just giving you're basically just giving someone money and they're not actually doing anything, or that there is no value being created there. This would be for all deals over $600. So, I mean, this is pretty much every big deal is going to have to go through the clearinghouse. I was reading something from Brandon Marcello of CBS, and he kind of went through what people are saying essentially. And according to the ACC, 90% of existing NIL contracts with public companies would have been approved, but more than 70% of the deals with booster collectives would have been denied. And so that's kind of the differentiating factor right there, right? These have to be true NIL deals and actually be kind of associated with what the player is worth and what the player's brand is worth. And if that is happening, then that makes a ton of sense. I mean, players deserve to make money, especially when they're providing a ton of value or if their brand is extremely recognizable. That makes all the sense in the world. But getting rid of those under the table deals in which you're just funneling money out of someone's account to a player and not actually them providing any value is finally going to be hopefully somewhat managed and taken away.
Yeah, I mean that's the end of the day. You can't have a guy sending out a tweet or two per year, getting paid $1 million by collective, and that's good enough. Like that's. I mean, without going down a huge rabbit hole, that's unfair to a lot of people, not just college athletes, right? Like you are taking advantage of that, and I understand like you're capitalizing on your name, image, and likeness to a great extent, but at the same time, it's not this fair market name, image, likeness, and this is what this is going to fix. And it's got to work. And if it doesn't work, then what do you go? Is it down to collective bargaining? We'll see. I mean, that's eventually maybe that's what is coming, but you hope that something like this can work. And I don't truly believe that it gets to this point that the SEC, Big 10, Big 12, ACC vote for this and say they're in favor of this as a collective on the opposite side of the federal things. They had to, we got to understand that both sides had to approve this. And so all of these schools are saying yes to this, which I think is a pretty good indicator that this has good potential to work. And that can't be something that's missed. I think so many schools are fed up with the NCAA and what they were incapable of doing that they wanted a good solution. Now they're voting on something that they believe in. This will start on July 1st is when the revenue share will be able to begin, kind of going into place. And you saw the tweets like programs the night this was announced were pushing through these revenue deals to get signed by midnight that night. And that truly is so these players don't start bailing. In my mind, let's get these done. Let's get them locked in. Now, what I'll say about from the Baylor perspective, Baylor was signing deals that were all essentially saying, hey, we are looking towards revenue share. We're going to base the things that we do off revenue share because there is a fear, maybe not a fear, but market reset is a true thing right now. Because if these NIL deals start vanishing of $1 million, of $500,000 for kids just tweeting stuff, there's going to be a hard market reset. A lot of schools got out ahead of that and said, we're going to give NIL deals before there's this governance. And so now they're going to have to come back And what happens after that? They paid a ton of money. These kids are going to want a ton of money that are coming into these programs. Well, that money is not going to necessarily be available anymore. So what Baylor did, from everything I've been told, is that they have said, we're not going to base this off of just pure NIL money. We're going to make sure that we're in line for the next 5-6 years. We're setting a good precedent, and Baylor fans should feel pretty confident. And we're going to discuss that more on Sikkim 365 Premium. Make sure you're checking that out. But it's an opportunity for Baylor to be ahead of the game right now. And I think a lot of schools that were smart are going to be ahead of the game with this.
I do too. And I would also say that I think most schools kind of were anticipating this coming. And I think this year, all the news that dropped, whether you look at BYU or what Texas Tech did, where essentially just a big alum came in and just funded an entire football team because they were able to, while this was still kind of going on. I think that happened for this year. I still think those schools are set up to understand what was coming.
Sure.
I don't think it was just like one of those, oh, we're going to do this and we think we're going to be able to do this every single year. It was very much this is our window. Let's take advantage of it. And I think that's what those schools did. And we'll see if that pays off. It didn't pay off for a couple schools that did that last year, specifically Ole Miss in football. But we'll see if it pays off there. I will say, kind of the estimates, and I'm not sure exactly what Baylor's going to do yet. And when we know, it'll probably be on Sikkim 365 Premium, but most of the money is going to be earmarked for football. When you kind of look around the landscape of things, I think most estimates have it around 70%. I think that's what most schools are going to put into football, the schools that truly care about football the most. And then you're going to have, 15%, 20% for men's basketball, and then 5 to 10% for everything else is kind of what I am envisioning. I kind of think that's probably going to be what it is for Baylor as well. I think football and basketball are going to kind of take precedent. But I do think there will be some concerted efforts to make sure that the baseball program still has some options and some opportunities to improve. Women's basketball is always going to be a bit of an emphasis for Baylor, and then potentially some other sports as well. But football and basketball are men's basketball are the ones that we're mainly looking at for most schools.
Yeah, and I think what's important to point out here is, yes, football is going to get that highest percentage across the board, but they also have now, unlimited scholarship players potentially. You have roster limits, but there's a huge chunk of athletes that are getting scholarships because of football. So the balance is really heavy that way towards football, but they also have a lot of players too. So it's probably exaggerated a little bit in your mind because it's a huge number when you're considering how many sports there are, where basketball has 13, or whatever that number is for other basketball programs. Baseball, softball, a little bit more. But you're talking about more than half of your student athletes in a lot of cases, or not more than half, a good percentage just on your football team. So, you talk about Big East schools, where does that money go when they don't have football that's really committed? But I think
all the basketball.
It's all going to basketball. I mean, I guess like $20 million, but then are they able to afford it because they don't have the football revenue coming in? What schools are able to do it? There will be some that obviously can. Like when we talk about Connecticut, I don't know of a program like Villanova, those, true Big East schools. I don't really know, but Baylor's going to be in good position. And I don't want to just make this all about Baylor, but that is who we discuss all the time on Sikkim 365. And I really feel confident that if the structure is in place, the enforcement arm is in position, that Baylor's upper echelon sports are going to be in a really good position. Baylor's willing to support their athletic program as a university. And I think that can't be overlooked because you start talking about increased scholarships and you start talking about the ability to share revenue with your student athletes. I mean, believe it or not, some schools aren't going to be able to pay their student athletes in their athletic department $20 million. They just can't afford it. And I think there are some schools in the Big 12 that aren't going to be able to afford necessarily being able to do that. I think Baylor, as it stands, does not have anything to worry about. And that's a huge deal, especially if you can increase scholarships a little bit per sport. That gives you a competitive advantage. And Baylor has to take advantage of that because you talk about $80,000 tuition. When you're talking about giving out revenue share, you have to offset that somehow, because if you give $80,000 to a player for an NIL deal for baseball, that's just covering their scholarship. So what are you going to do? Like, you've got to make sure these things work, make sure these numbers work, and make sure you're ahead of the game. I think Baylor will do that, and I think you have to have confidence in Baylor, Mack Rhoades, athletic department, to have that foresight. And then obviously the general board of directors, board of regents, they're willing to make that commitment. President Livingstone is willing to make that commitment to set up the entire athletic department, not just a football program.
Right. I think it's important to mention that I still think there's going to be a separation between the top teams in the country, just because I do think they're going to be able to land bigger NIL deals for some of their players. And I think their brands are going to be a big part of things. Right. And I think those bigger brands might be able to set up opportunities for their student athletes that maybe Baylor won't be able to. And so I still think you're going to have your traditional blue bloods that are going to have more resources and more opportunities to give big paychecks to players. But I think when you go down to that next level, you're giving schools like Baylor, and it's not just Baylor, it's schools at that same level, opportunities to actually jump up and compete for a national championship in various sports, right? I think that's the biggest thing. You're creating more parity. You're giving more opportunities for things to be a little more even than they have been over the past couple of years, where NIL was just, kind of do whatever you want.
Yeah.
In kind of the Wild West. I think this adds more structure to that. It gives Baylor a better opportunity to compete every single year. And that's the biggest part of this. I remain a little pessimistic on how well the clearinghouse is going to do. And really all of this is going to come down to the enforcement and those type of things. Because if nothing's enforced here, then it won't matter at all. And this will become irrelevant. But if it is heavily monitored and you're actually seeing punishments handed out and you're actually seeing that this is working and you're seeing schools being able to build competitive rosters going forward, then I think you can definitely have a positive outlook on this. I don't think Baylor has to worry about that this year. Their roster is very competitive and should be very good. But going forward, obviously, there's questions that still need to be answered. But this does, like we said, with kind of the playoff format, like we've said kind of multiple times about various decisions that are made, this one feels like one that is very relevant for Baylor and schools like Baylor for them to remain competitive and be potentially at the top of their sport on any given year.
Yeah, I think we're going to know within 6 to 12 months if this is going to work. And I'm not sure about the time frame, because how soon are teams willing to try to test this clearinghouse? Yeah. I don't think we're going to see that immediately. So I don't know when the window exactly is, but at some point, some booster will be willing to make a huge deal with a player and say, oh, he's going to be the face of my $1 billion business and he's going to do this and this. Well, if it's determined that this is not fair market value or this is not within the guidelines, what happens? And when that's made an example, if this stuff is public, front facing to you and I, to the media, and we're able to report on it, I think that's going to be the key. Because as soon as that stuff comes to light, the people who are not involved are going to want to call it out, because it's going to get major clicks and attention. If that happens, that's, to me, the kind of the accountability factor of make this stuff public so we know what's going on. And then let the public determine. And that sounds bad, but like, if it's not in the forefront and we're not able to see this stuff, why teams are getting in trouble, then we're never going to make the determination if this stuff is going to be good or not. And so I'm anxious to see within 6 to 12 months what happens, and if any schools are willing to push it. If teams aren't willing to push it in those 6 to 12 months, they might have something here. If you see someone kind of pushing the envelope within 6 to 12 months, then maybe the schools are saying this isn't that big a deal. And we're going to have a good indication of if this stuff will be stable through multiple years, or if we're going to be making another change in the next 5 or 6 years.
We absolutely will. Be sure to check out the Sikkim 365 Premium. Colt, I know we're going to have down the line coming out probably tomorrow. We're going to have some other news and notes that are going to be coming out as well, kind of surrounding this, as this is a huge topic for college sports in general and for Baylor specifically. So be sure to check that out if you have not already. There'll be a lot of information on that. Outside of that, Colt and I will be back later this week with another episode, kind of more general football topics, most likely, and then potentially another preview for the official visits, which will be on Sikkim 365 Premium. So be sure to check that out as well. But thanks for listening today. This has been the Bearcast on Sikkim365.com.
Join Sikkim 365 Premium on a $1 for 1 month trial to read our experts' notes and insights. Know about high school commits, off-season transfers, coaching staff changes, and so much more before the rest. Also, download the Sikkim 365 app on your iPhone today to get instant notifications of breaking news, read up on the latest inside info, easily interact with other Baylor fans on our forums, and get alerts for anything published by your favorite staff members.